Hello and namaskar to everyone. Welcome to my channel. What do you think? How hard is Indian entrance exam? Hard? Let's find out. आज हम रिएक्शन करने जा रहे हैं जोश चेन के एक वीडियो पर. वीडियो का टॉपिक है हाउ हार्ड इज इंडियाज हार्डेस्ट एंट्रेंस एग्जाम. हार्डर देन यूएस एग्जाम्स? क्वेश्चन मार्क. So let's find out. Let's go.
They should not make kids this young have to learn this much stuff. And even though this isn't necessarily the hardest test for someone who's graduated college, ridiculous amount of respect for being able to do this. So in some of my previous videos, my Anime Doro video and my MIT Orgo exam video, a lot of people commented things like, oh, Indian kids have to study 15 hours a day for the JEE, or things like, oh, Indian kids learn this in grade 11, right? So after I heard this, I was like, what the heck is the JEE? So I decided to take a look into it myself. Now, I'm currently a US medical student, so I've taken my fair share of tricky exams. So I want to see if this is one of those situations where it's like an Asian parent bragging about how much their son studies, or if this is actually the real deal, and actually a very difficult exam. Now, the JEE is the Indian Engineering Entrance Exam, and it stands for Joint Entrance Exam. From what I hear, there are two tests, the JEE Main and the JEE Advanced. So if you score high enough on the JEE Main, around the 99th percentile or so, you get to take the JEE Advanced. And if you score high enough on the JEE Advanced, you can qualify to get into schools like IIT, which is equivalent to the MIT of the which is equivalent to the MIT of India. Now, the JEE Main is split into 3 sections and 2 separate papers. So the 3 sections are math, physics, and chemistry, and then there are 2 papers. Each of these papers are 3 hours long, meaning you get a little bit over 2 minutes per question. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the JEE Advanced, just trying to do some of it, looking over some of the problems, and hopefully showing you guys some of it, and just giving my general thoughts on how difficult I think this exam actually is.
I'm not trying to solve anything. I know I will fail. Math section.
Now first off, we're going to start with the math section, and with the math section you could already see that this test isn't necessarily impossible, it's just very tricky. You're being tested on a very wide range of math from Algebra 2 all the way up to Calculus and a little bit of statistics as well, but they're testing you way further than just surface level on these topics. Like for example here, it just wants you to see that you know how to calculate the roots of a polynomial, and then you just do some simple but annoying multiplication. But solving for these roots won't actually give you whole numbers, so that's something that you can already tell the test is trying to be a little bit tricky about. Like question number 2 is not too bad. Question number 3, also just a calculus problem, and especially when I saw this question number 6, it was pretty interesting. I'll include the answer key. I'll actually show you guys the answer key on the right side. It has a very logical and like reasonable way to go about solving it. It's just step by step, right? But the thing is, there are a lot of very specific steps involved, that just so many of these little things that like when it comes to crunch time, like you might think of it, you might not think of it, and that's what makes this problem so hard, because even though it's just an optimization problem, there are so many simple, like sort of niche steps that you have to take in order to get this problem right. And something like question number 8 that requires you to have an understanding of matrices. In high school math in the United States, even if you go up to calculus, you probably won't see something like this. So this is an example of the JEE just having a very large scope of things that you need to know. Like honestly, some of this stuff I feel like there's no need for you to know it in high school, but that's beyond me. And then as you go further on the test, especially when I got to like section number 3, like this thing, look at how disgusting this looks. Look at how long and disgusting this problem is. I'm gonna put the answer key up. This solution is probably also very long, tricky, confusing, and disgusting. Oh, this is tricky, man. I wouldn't even attempt that. I wouldn't even attempt this type of problem, because to be frank, it's quite difficult. I would say that most of these problems on section 3 are just quite difficult for someone who doesn't have a very, very, very strong grasp on math. And I took calculus in high school. I took calculus 1 and calculus 2 in college, right? But section number 3 really requires you to have a little bit more of an understanding of math and some of the trickier topics that people normally like to just glaze over, or when they test you on, like, will test you on easier problems. So I'm gonna say that section number 1 and 2 difficulty level, I'll say, in terms of concepts, is pretty simple. In terms of the actual questions, maybe a 6.5 out of 10. But section 3, the concepts are pretty tricky, and the actual difficulty, I might give a 9 out of 10. Now, moving on to physics, I also haven't taken physics in a couple years, but straight off the bat, I can see that it tests you on probably even a deeper level than a lot of college physics classes will test you on. Here, like, this type of problem that's not straight up just a ball laying on a curve, but actually is actually indented a little bit into this plank, is a much trickier problem than just a ball on a plank. But you can also see that there's a mix of very doable questions along these, like, harder questions. Like, question number 2 is not a very tricky question, nor is question number 3. And when you move on and see more of the test, you'll see that a lot of these questions, they mix in, like, simpler questions like question number 5 with more tricky questions. Especially question number 6 is something that you'll see and is a pretty standard problem. And you can definitely see that the JEE physics has quite a broad scope. You can see some of this, like thermal physics right over here that goes over things like radiation. You can see here that there's, like, a little bit of quantum physics. That's what it looks like. Like, these aren't, some of these topics you don't touch on very closely in high school, and, like, you have to wait till you get a little deeper into college to do this. Like, even question number 10, a pattern that I'm starting to see a lot is that on the JEE, they don't necessarily test you on the hardest concepts. They just test you on trickier versions of the simpler concept. That's a very apparent thing with question number 10. I think that even on a college level physics exam, they probably wouldn't test you on this unless they wanted to be mean. Same with 11. Same with 12. Actually, this isn't a topic that I'm all that familiar with. Yeah, you can see here that a lot of these problems, once again, not the trickiest concepts. They are topics that you learn how to do when you're taking something like AP Physics in high school, but it's very likely that when you're actually tested on this, they will give you easier versions of these problems than they do here. Except on the JEE, they actually test you in depth on the trickier versions of these problems, which is what makes this exam just so difficult. If I were to rate this test, the physics section difficulty, yes, I would give it also a 9 out of 10. Not because it's topics that you've never seen.
For me, 10 out of 10 for maths and physics both, because that is not my subject. I decided to go with commerce instead of science after 10. So,
or it's, like, impossible to do, but it actually requires you to have a very strong grasp on these concepts in order to do it. It's not just like a lot of these problems aren't just 1 or 2 step simple problems, or like your standard, like, physics problems. They're variations on your standard physics problems, which make them much more difficult. Now, moving on to the chemistry section, the first thing I noticed was that, first of all, we didn't necessarily learn all that much about the topics that we went over, the topics that question number 1 covers, right? But this is an example of how, I guess, a lot of the JE is also just test-taking skills. If you know that the most probable and the average speeds are in a 1-to-1 ratio, and that almost right off the bat eliminates A, C, and D, giving B to be the correct answer, which is not too tricky. I think if you look at this, Like this is writing out a chemical equation. This is identifying precipitates and what's soluble and what's insoluble. So far, the chemistry is not very tricky at all. This is actually like AP chemistry level stuff. So technically, first and second year college stuff, but there are some kids that learn this in high school. However, something like question number 4, question number 5, straight off the bat, this is organic chemistry. Like even for a college organic chemistry course, some of these Newton projections aren't even the simplest. They're not even the most standard ones, which shows you that even if these tests test simple topics, they on the JE they like to give you complex versions of these simple topics. For example, here this Newton projection, I'll just draw like this. A lot of people wouldn't be able to see it straight off the bat. I think that this one. Let's try. I definitely know people that would have struggled a lot to draw out these Newton projections, without a doubt. But yeah, like you can see that the JEE is testing you on a lot of organic chemistry. So now I actually participated in chemistry olympiad in my time in high school, right? And a lot of kids were really good at doing inorganic and physical chemistry, right? Which is what some of the first page tested you on, but didn't really have a lot of knowledge of organic chemistry just because in high school in the United States, they don't really teach you organic chemistry. So while these aren't the most tricky chemistry problems, a US chemistry student would definitely not be able to do this just because of the scope. The scope is much wider than in a US class. I think, in my opinion, the chemistry section is without a doubt the easiest section on this test. And I think that aside from the organic chemistry, which a college level organic chemistry student would be able to do without much difficulty, so yeah, in conclusion, I think if you took away all the organic chemistry problems in this test, the difficulty might be like a 5.5 out of 10. Very typical for what an AP chemistry student would see, but because the AP chemistry is included, and that just includes a huge scope of things that like you probably would have never learned in high school, the difficulty is probably a 9. Okay, so here are my conclusions. So for all those kids in the comments who are like, oh, Indian kids study 15 hours a day for the JEE, bro, 15 hours is not enough, man. You probably have to do
15 hours is not enough, yes, that's true.
20 hours a day, 25, 30 hours a day in order to pass this in high school. Because the thing is, what I noticed, the scope of this exam is just crazy. Like, you're learning across the board, across math, chemistry, and physics, things that sophomore level, second year in college students would be learning in the US, and actually probably across most countries, right? And the thing is, you can't just have like a basic understanding of these things to do well on the exam. You actually have to have a very deep understanding of these topics in order to do well on something like the test that I just showed you, right? Because the thing is, what I notice is that they don't test you on the most advanced topics, right? I've taken courses that are quite a bit more advanced than some of these topics, but even these advanced topics, if you're in college, they might test you on some of the easier problems that go along with the
That is why Indian engineers, doctors, scientists are amazing.
advanced topics. No, they test you on like the medium advanced topics on the JEE, but they'll give you the hardest questions in the problem set, and that is, I would rather take the advanced topics with the easier questions than the medium advanced topics with the hardest questions any day, because those questions are just tricky for anyone, but kids that young, that's ridiculous to me. So I'm just gonna say mad respect to all the kids out there who have to take the JEE, and my full support, mad respect. Like, I'm just gonna say that when I was in high school, there was maybe with some training I could do better than I would have done without training. Well, actually, obviously that was a dumb statement, but I wouldn't have passed this test I wouldn't have done well enough on this test to go to the IITs of India. I would have done way worse. I think even across the United States, there is probably only a handful of students, a small handful of students, less than a couple hundred students, right, that can do very, very well in high school on all three of these sections. I think that there are probably a couple thousand students out there that can do well on individual sections as they come. Maybe do really well in physics, or do really well in chemistry, or do really well in math. But because the scope is so wide, I think there's only a small number of high school students in the U.S. that can do well on all three of those sections. And actually, but those students are actually the top, the most gifted kids in the U.S. I think most students wouldn't even be able to get like 4 or 5 of those questions right. They would struggle too much. And I think compared to a test like the SAT, some people like to say the SAT is a joke, and as a US student, obviously I don't like hearing that, right? Because I had to study very hard. But yes, compared to this test, the SAT is an absolute joke. It's an absolute joke. The math is not even comparable to something like this, okay? And even the MCAT is an example of a test that tests you on maybe slightly more advanced topics, right? But tests you on the easy questions. Like, the questions on this are much trickier than the MCAT, even though the level might be a little bit lower. And like, that is without a doubt. And the physics section on this, 100 times harder than even the physics section on the MCAT. So once again, I will just say, after taking a look at the JEE, my conclusion is that this is the real deal. This is probably one of the hardest, hands down the hardest level high school exam I've ever seen. And once again, mad respects to all the kids out there grinding for the JEE, and I wish you guys all the best. If you like this video, like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see. And remember, when you do anime Doro for a test like this is how you get to IIT.
This is how you get to IIT. And I totally agree with this guy. Josh Chen, I'm giving his details in my descriptions. Please go and subscribe to his channel. He's an amazing kid. Honestly speaking, he was very honest about it. And I don't think so I knew that I wouldn't be able to perform to that level with that competition, so I decided not to be a part of that race. I decided some other way. I went to commerce, and then I went to hotel management. But it was all right for me. Thank you so much, and please do let me know how do you like the video, and please do comment, like, and subscribe to my channel. Your one subscription means a lot to me. Thank you so much.